What if the First Crusade wasn't actually started by the Pope? The initiator wasn't an emperor, nor was it a great king. It all began with a single man, short of stature, filthy, clad in ragged sackcloth, a man known to history as Peter the Hermit. In 1095, Pope Urban II called knights to arms, promising the remission of sins for the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. But while barons and dukes were gathering their armies, forging swords and planning routes, this man was already acting. He had no interest in knights. His power lay elsewhere. It lay in a voice burning with fanaticism. The truth is paradoxical, and history textbooks often overlook it. The official knightly crusade hadn't even begun, yet Peter the Hermit was already leading crusaders behind him. But instead of an army, following him was an unmanageable crowd of 100,000 poor people, women, the elderly, monks, and brigands, all intoxicated with faith and a thirst for a miracle. They went into history as the People's Crusade, and this event turned into a catastrophe. Today, we begin our series on the greatest clash of civilizations, and we begin it with the man who became the detonator that blew up the medieval world, with the man who single-handedly changed the course of world history. What did the Peter the Hermit actually see, or claim to see, in Jerusalem that forced him to act? How did he, a simple monk without a penny to his name, manage to raise hundreds of thousands of people before the Pope himself did? Why did his holy pilgrimage instantly turn into a bloody massacre, Jewish pogroms, and looting? And how did the prophet, chosen by God, turn out to be a coward in the decisive moment, twice fleeing the battlefield and betraying those he himself had led to their deaths? This is a story about the destructive power possessed by blind faith. A story about how one man, perhaps sincerely believing in his mission, opened the gates of hell on earth. We will see his triumph as he marched at the head of a numberless crowd. We will see his despair when this crowd perishes from hunger, cannibalism, and Turkish swords. And we will trace the fall of the man who lit the flame and was consumed by it himself. This is Peter the Hermit, the visionary who started a war.
To understand why tens of thousands of people followed a barefoot fanatic, we must go back a few years, before the Pope's famous call. Around 1093, Peter, then still a little-known monk from Amiens, undertakes a step considered the main life goal of any pious Christian. He sets off on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. But the Jerusalem of the late 11th century is not at all the place he expected to see. The world was bursting at the seams. Just 22 years prior, in 1071, the Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam, dealt the Byzantine Empire a crushing defeat at Manzikert. This event became a geopolitical catastrophe. Anatolia, the breadbasket of Byzantium, fell. The Christian world, in essence, lost Asia. Walking on foot, Peter sees this new world with his own eyes. He sees how the Seljuk Turks, whom he considers barbarians and oppressors, control the Holy Land. Now, let's sort out what happened next. This is the key moment that will trigger the entire chain of events. Being a son of his era, Peter looked not for facts, but for signs, and he found them. Later, he would recount that he witnessed unbearable horrors and the oppression of Christian pilgrims. How truthful were these stories? Historians argue to this day. The Seljuks, unlike the previous Arab rulers, were indeed less tolerant and more chaotic. They introduced high taxes on pilgrims, and the roads became dangerous. But were these the horrors about which Peter screamed? Or was this simply what a fanatically minded man wanted to see? Peter thought he was seeing the apocalypse and the desecration of shrines. In reality, he was likely seeing a banal change of power, corruption, and banditry on the roads which always accompany the fall of one empire and the rise of another. Thus, a man who set out to atone for sins found the pretext for the greatest war in history. According to the legend, which he himself would actively spread, a vision descended upon him in Jerusalem. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, or Christ himself, appeared to him and ordered him to return to Europe and rouse the Christians for the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. Peter received a divine mission, and he returned, not simply a monk, but a prophet. He returned with a letter, allegedly from the Patriarch of Jerusalem, full of pleas for help. He returned with burning eyes and a story that made the blood run cold in any listener's veins. He saw what others did not see. Or, at the very least, he forced them to believe it. He became a living evidence of the suffering of the East. He lacked only one thing: the political will that could turn his words into an army. And he set off to find this will in Rome. We see a lonely fanatic. In his hands, a dubious letter from the Patriarch. In his head, a vision that is impossible to verify. He believes his mission to save Jerusalem. But in his plan, there was one detail he hadn't suspected. He did not control the situation. He was merely the spark, but the powder keg was already waiting for the fire, prepared by a completely different man. In 1095, in the city of Clermont, Pope Urban II was already gathering a council. He had his own, far more global plans to stop the internecine wars in Europe, to unite the knights under his banner, and, most importantly, to strengthen the power of Rome, perhaps even subjugating the weakened Byzantium. Around this time, the Pope was looking for a pretext. That's when Peter the Hermit appears, the perfect instrument, a living proof, a prophet sent from above. And when they met, Urban II understood the time had come. He would give Peter what he lacked, the papal blessing. But neither the Pope nor Peter could foresee one thing. Their alliance would spawn not the army they expected. It would spawn a monster. The meeting of Peter the Hermit and Pope Urban II is a historic moment where personal fanaticism collides with high politics, and each participant sees in the other merely a tool to achieve their own goals. Picture this scene. On one side, Pope Urban II, a brilliant politician, an aristocrat, the former abbot of Cluny. His universe was built on geopolitical calculations. On one hand, he needed to direct the violent, uncontrollable energy of European knights who were bogged down in internecine wars somewhere else. The truce of God was working poorly. An external enemy was needed. On the other hand, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was desperately asking for help against the Turks, and Urban saw a chance in this. A chance not just to help, but possibly to reunite the Church, split in 1054, but now under the authority of Rome. And right at this moment, while the Pope is weighing all the pros and cons, Peter appears before him, barefoot in a dirty hair shirt, but with burning eyes. He does not speak of geopolitics. He speaks of horrors, of a vision, of the Patriarch's tears, and of a direct order from Christ. He brings what Urban's cold calculation lacked: divine justification. Pope Urban II, a prince of the Church and master of geopolitics, assumed that this beggar prophet would become the key. His fiery speeches would prepare the ground, and his fanaticism would become the battering ram that would breach the wall of indifference, and then the Pope's call in Clermont would be heard by all. Peter the Hermit, intoxicated by the divine vision, was convinced.
The Holy Father has affirmed my path. God's vicar himself has recognized my mission. Now it is not simply a man speaking through my lips, but the entire church." But both were mistaken. The Pope politician assumed he was releasing a manageable element. He thought he held the leash in his hands, but in reality, he had just removed the chain from an uncontrollable beast that he himself had nurtured. On November 26, 1095, Pope Urban II delivers his famous speech at the Council of Clermont. He addresses the knights, the nobility, those who can bear a sword. He speaks of rich lands in the east, of the forgiveness of sins. He sets the official date for departure, August 15, 1096. In this same crowd, Peter the Hermit takes the floor. He repeats the Pope's speech, but his words sound different. Urban appealed to duty and profit. Peter appealed to a miracle and immediate salvation. Urban proposed an organized military campaign. Peter proposed an apocalyptic exodus. The Pope blessed Peter to preach, giving him official status, legalizing his fanaticism. He made him his unofficial mouthpiece, and this mouthpiece turned out to be 100 times louder than the Pope himself. So the order is given. The Council of Clermont is concluded. Pope Urban II is pleased. He has launched the greatest project of his pontificate. The knights and barons of France, Germany, and Italy disperse to their castles. They have almost 9 months to raise money, mortgage estates, and prepare armor and provisions. Everything is going to plan. But there is one problem: Peter the Hermit. He had no intention of waiting for August 1096. Why? He doesn't need to forge swords or gather provisions. His army, as he believed, would be led by God himself. The Pope thought Peter would prepare the people for the crusade, but Peter decided that the crusade had already begun. And while the aristocracy was only planning, Peter was already acting. In the winter of 1095 and the spring of 1096, he sets off on a tour that will go into history. He goes from city to city, riding his donkey, bareheaded, in a dirty cassock, and every word of his is a spark falling onto dry straw. Europe that year was suffering from crop failure, famine, and epidemics. Thousands of people had nothing to lose, and they didn't hear the Pope, they heard Peter. And the flame he lit instantly spiraled out of control. What happened in the spring of 1096 cannot be explained by religion alone. Europe was balancing on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Crop failures, hunger, plagues, and a constant fear of the future created the perfect soil for a preacher who promised not just forgiveness of sins, but an immediate miracle. Peter the Hermit embodied exactly this kind of prophet. His tour through northern France and Germany became a triumph of mass hysteria. Unlike a polished bishop, he seemed flesh of the people's flesh. Imagine, into a starving, disease-ridden town, riding a donkey, enters a small man. He is barefoot. He is dressed in a dirty, coarse wool cassock. His face is emaciated, but his eyes burn with an otherworldly fire. He doesn't read a sermon from a book. He screams, he weeps, he gestures wildly, telling of the horrors he personally witnessed in Jerusalem. His charisma gained absolute power. People abandoned everything. Craftsmen dropped their tools. Peasants abandoned their plows. They came out of their homes, mesmerized by his speech. He promised them not an arduous military campaign. He promised that God would lead them, that the walls of enemy cities would fall on their own, just as the walls of Jericho fell, that hunger and disease would remain behind in sinful Europe, and ahead awaited the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. It is vital to realize who followed him. Pope Urban II called for knights, warriors, professionals. Those who followed Peter
were those who had nothing to lose. It wasn't knights who set out, but commoners, beggars, peasants who had lost their land, petty criminals, monks who had fled their monasteries, women, the elderly. These were the marginals and outcasts, dreaming of redemption and, more importantly, of a better life. A gigantic migration of the desperate was unfolding. They thought they were going on a holy pilgrimage that would miraculously turn into a triumph. Peter thought he was leading an army of saints chosen by God. In reality, however, the destitute monk created a crowd of 100,000 doomed to destruction. An army marched that possessed neither provisions, nor weapons, nor discipline, nor the slightest idea of what awaited them. They sewed crosses made of branches onto their tattered clothes and believed that this was enough. Peter the Hermit lit a wildfire he could no longer control. This unmanageable mass, which received the name the People's Crusade, gathered in Cologne and in April 1096 moved east, 4 months earlier than the Pope had planned. Their exodus had begun. 100,000 hungry, fanatical, and uncontrollable people moved across all of Europe. They marched, led by the belief that they were the army of Christ. But this army had one fundamental problem. It possessed absolutely no money and no supplies, none at all. Peter and his followers sincerely believed that Christian cities and villages along the way would feed them for free as holy pilgrims. They were brutally mistaken. The first stop on their path became the cities of the Rhineland, and it was here, without having met a single Muslim yet, that this crowd of pilgrims found their first enemy. The targets turned out to be the local Jewish communities. For in the eyes of these fanatics, the logic was simple. Why should we walk thousands of kilometers to fight the enemies of Christ if these enemies live right here among us? What began as a holy campaign instantly turned into a bloody slaughter.
The People's Crusade did not begin with battles against the Turks. It began with the most brutal Jewish pogroms in the cities along the Rhine. In the spring of 1096, crowds led by Peter's disciples, such as Count Emico of Leiningen, descended upon the Jewish communities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. The logic of these crusaders was simple, yet monstrous. We travel thousands of kilometers to punish the enemies of Christ, yet they live right here among us. They crucified our Lord. Let us begin with them. It wasn't just looting taking place, but ritual violence. Thousands of Jews were killed. They were given a choice: baptism or death. Many, seeing the hopelessness, preferred to kill their own children and themselves rather than renounce their faith. Local bishops tried to hide them, but the fanatical mob, intoxicated with blood and impunity, broke even into episcopal palaces. Peter the Hermit himself, although not the direct initiator of these specific pogroms, set the tone. He demanded money and provisions from Jewish communities, threatening them. He opened Pandora's box, and violence became the norm. Loaded with this bloody booty, Peter's army moved further, towards Hungary. And here, their first clash awaited them not with infidels, but with fellow Christians. The Hungarian king Koloman the Learned, having heard of the atrocities in Germany, was horrified by this horde. He allowed them to pass, but forbade looting. The ban did not last long. When the Crusaders reached the city of Zemun, a conflict flared up over provisions. Peter's people stormed the city, staged a massacre, and looted it, transforming from pilgrims into open enemies of the Hungarian crown. The Hungarian army attacked them, and the army of the poor suffered its first heavy casualties. Battered, having lost thousands of people, they finally hobbled to the borders of the Byzantine Empire, to Constantinople.
Emperor Alexios I Komnenos expected to see a disciplined army of mercenary knights, which he had requested from the Pope. Instead, a horde of 100,000 ragamuffins, fanatics, and bandits, who had already managed to sack 2 Christian cities, approached the walls of his capital. Alexios was horrified. Looking at this roaring crowd, the emperor's strategist thought, "I asked for warriors and I got locusts, not an army, but a plague that will devour my suburbs and ravage my capital." Peter, blinded by his mission, thought, "We are at the gates of the new Rome. Now the pious Christian emperor will embrace us as brothers, and God's army will receive everything necessary for the final holy push." Reality proved different. Alexios Komnenos, that sophisticated politician, saw before him not a prophet, but merely the ringleader of an unruly horde. He had no intention of letting this chaos into his city. His only pragmatic goal was to usher this problem across the Bosphorus to the Asian shore, straight into the maw of the Turks. The emperor generously supplied them with provisions and gave wise advice. "Wait here. Wait for the main army of knights. Do not engage the Turks alone. They are professional warriors. They will destroy you." Peter the Hermit agreed, but he had long since ceased to control anything. In August 96, the People's Crusade found itself in Asia Minor. They set up camp in a place called Civetot. The emperor's order was clear: wait. But a crowd of 100,000 cannot wait. It needs to eat. Fanaticism demanded action, and hunger demanded plunder. Peter's people, ignoring his calls for caution, began to disperse into the surrounding area, looting local Greek villages. They were in enemy territory. The Seleucid Turks, ruling these lands from their capital, Nicaea, watched this chaos. At first, they couldn't believe their luck. They saw not an army, but a huge, disorganized rabble. One of the Crusaders' detachments, predominantly Germans, seized a small castle called Xerigordon. They celebrated victory, but the triumph became a trap. The Turks immediately surrounded the castle and, most terribly, seized the only water source. A torturous siege began. Inside the castle, there wasn't a drop of water. The Crusaders drank the blood of their donkeys and their own urine. After 8 days, they surrendered. The Turks offered them a choice: accept Islam or death. Many refused and were killed. And at this very moment, while this tragedy was unfolding, Peter the Hermit was not with them. He was staying in Constantinople, trying to beg more supplies from the emperor. He had already lost control over his army, and now that army was losing its life.
When news of the massacre at Civetot reached the main camp at Civetot, it exploded. But it didn't explode with fear, but with fury and envy. Turkish spies, having infiltrated the camp, skillfully spread a rumor that the Germans at Xerigordon had not only captured the castle, but also fabulous riches. The crowd, already agitated, demanded action. They accused the absent Peter the Hermit of cowardice. They shouted that he had conspired with the emperor and was keeping them there while others divided the loot. The leaders remaining in the camp lost all control. On October 21, 1096, a massive, unruly crowd, tens of thousands of men, women, and children, left the camp and surged down the road toward Nicaea, the Seljuk capital. They marched without formation, without reconnaissance. Many were armed only with clubs and scythes. They thought they were going to avenge their brothers and loot a rich city. They believed that God would protect them, as he had protected them until now. In reality, they were marching straight into one of the most brilliant and brutal ambushes in military history.
Sultan Kilij Arslan I was ready. He allowed this crowd to be drawn into the narrow, forest-covered valley of Draco. And when the vanguard of the Crusaders was drawn in deep enough, the Turks attacked. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. A hail of arrows rained down on the road from the hills. Turkish cavalry attacked from the flanks, cutting off the path of retreat. The infantry struck head-on. The crowd, which just a minute ago had roared in anticipation of victory, turned into a mass insane with terror. People trampled one another. The knights, who were pitifully few, tried to fight back, but they were simply swept away. Thousands were killed on the spot. Tens of thousands, mostly women and young boys, were taken prisoner and sold into slavery throughout the East. Only a few managed to break through to the camp at Civetot. The People's Crusade was over. It did not reach Jerusalem. It did not even reach the first Syrian city. It was destroyed within a 3-hour walk from its own camp. When Peter the Hermit returned to Constantinople, he returned to ashes. Almost nothing remained of his army of 100,000. Byzantine ships picked him and the miserable remnants of the survivors up and ferried them back to Constantinople. The prophet who promised his followers the promised land had led them to a slaughterhouse. His mission, his vision, his army, all had turned to dust. Peter the Hermit is broken. He sits in Constantinople, disgraced, bewildered, having lost everything. His name became synonymous with catastrophe. But the history of the Crusades did not end there. It was only beginning. While Peter mourned his lost army, real warriors appeared on the horizon. In the winter of 1096 and the spring of 1097, those whom Pope Urban II had actually called began to arrive in Constantinople. The armies of Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse. Thousands of knights in armor, with siege engines, discipline, and most importantly, with ruthless and ambitious leaders. The Paupers' Crusade was merely a false start. The real war was beginning now. The paradox lies in the fact that Peter the Hermit, this failed prophet, decides to join them. Having lost his leadership and status as a prophet, he is simply a shadow, a stray monk, a reminder of recent disgrace. The knights look at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He thinks he can finish what he started, that his presence will sanctify this campaign. In reality, he is destined to walk this path to the end, but now as a living ghost. He is destined to see what he so craved, the siege of the great cities of the East. But it is there, beneath the walls of Antioch, that his faith and his courage will undergo the final, most terrible test. And he will not withstand it.
Peter the Hermit, having joined the knightly host, turned into a living specter. He walked the same path along which he had led his perished army, but now in the shadow of true warlords. For Godfrey of Bouillon and Bohemond of Taranto, he was not a prophet, but a walking reminder of how not to wage war. He still tried to preach, but his authority was annihilated. His word no longer carried any weight. In 1097, the knightly army, unlike the poor, took Nicaea, and then they approached the walls of Antioch, a vast, impregnable city. And here, hell began. The siege of Antioch dragged on for 8 long, agonizing months. What was happening resembled not a war, but a slow agony. A terrible famine began in the Crusader camp. People ate their horses, ate rats, ate leather belts, and then they began to eat each other. Documents of that time are full of blood-curdling reports of cannibalism within the Crusader camp.
Peter the Hermit, the man who promised his followers paradise on earth, now saw with his own eyes the hell he helped unleash. He saw the army of Christ devouring the dead, and this horror crushed him completely. The prophet who saw visions of Christ, who fearlessly spoke with the Pope, who raised an army of 100,000, turned out to be unprepared for real war. One night, unable to withstand the hunger and despair, Peter the Hermit, God's chosen one, attempted to flee. He thought, "I cannot bear this. This is not the war I promised. God has abandoned us." He believed he could slip away unnoticed under the cover of night. In reality, he was fleeing not from the Turks, he was fleeing from the consequences of his own sermons. His escape looked pathetic. He simply jumped on a rope and ran away from the wall. But he was caught almost immediately by a patrol of the Norman prince Tancred. They dragged him back to the camp. The next morning, the prophet stood before the leaders of the crusade, disgraced. Tancred forced him to publicly swear that he would never leave the army again. Thus came the end of Peter the Hermit as a historical figure. He had completely lost all respect. He reached Jerusalem, he saw the city taken, but he was there as a nobody, just one of thousands of ragged monks in the crowd. After the triumph of the knights, his trail fades. He received neither lands nor titles. He simply boarded a ship and sailed back to France. The man who lit the flame that engulfed the whole world returned home and died quietly in 1115 as the founder of a small monastery. His vision came true, but he himself turned out to be too human for that vision.
Peter the Hermit lit a fire that he could not extinguish. His personal tragedy stopped no one, because history is driven not by reason, but by faith. And if Peter served merely as the spark, the true fire approaches with the army of knights. One of them will turn the chaos of the Crusade of the Poor into a war machine. His name is Godfrey of Bouillon. And in the next episode, we will show how he took what Peter started and turned it into a legend. Like this video if the paradox of Peter struck you. Leave comments, which hero of the Crusades do you want to see in our episodes? And of course, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the story of how Godfrey of Bouillon took Jerusalem. See you next time.